Hello everyone, I'm Somdatta Karak. I welcome everyone to CCMB Conversations. This is a space for us to discuss how science and technology are shaping up in India with experts around us. Today we have Hema Somanathan, professor at IISER Thiruvananthapuram. She studies the relationships between plants and pollinators. Some of these form very specific pairs and some choices are fairly generalized. Together, the varieties of plants and pollinators form a complex network, and Hema tries to elucidate the structure of this network. In today's times of climate change, where pollinators are declining, it's important we understand the details of pollinators better. So that's the premise that I understand of your work, Hema. But welcome to CCMB Conversations.
Thank you very much. So yes, as you rightly pointed out, I think, these mutualisms have been seen for a very long time, but they assume immediate importance in the context of habitat change, fragmentation, climate, and so on. And I will add over here that if you look at the tropics, especially the Asian tropics, including the Indian tropics, there is very little data that is available for us to even try and begin to understand what is actually going on. So that is the unfortunate part, that, in order to be able to address, what is going on under the current scenario of change, global change and so on, we don't have the historical data or even contemporary data to figure out, what is it that we have to do and where is the intervention required. So that is a big research lacuna in the field that is very critical to address.
That sets the premise for a conversation very well. And maybe I will begin with first asking you, what is your motivation to study plants and pollinators interaction? Is it to understand the ecology or the evolution? Is it for climate change? I mean, what is your motivation really?
Yeah, so we don't, at least my take on this, that I have been interested in mutualistic interactions to try and understand how these mutualistic partners across trophic levels, plant pollinators, are wired to each other. From basically to try and understand how these interactions evolved. So that is where it started and that is where it still is. And to try and understand, adaptations that plants might possess or animals, the pollinators might possess in order to be, able to visit flowers and so on. The current scenario of global change and, habitat fragmentation, climate and so on, is an offshoot of this, because what we still try to do is to try and study these interactions in as unperturbed conditions as available, and then try and see, okay, when there are perturbations or disturbances, then what happens to these interactions? Do they unravel, or is there enough robustness? Are they resilient to these changes? If so, how resilient are they? Are there specific groups that are more vulnerable and so on? So that an offshoot of, the main interest is in trying to understand these co-evolutionary processes between plants and pollinators. Yeah.
So if you're trying to understand the evolution of these two groups as plants and pollinators, and I assume these are flowering plants that we are talking about, I mean, I am always amazed with the huge numbers of these organisms, right? Like, how do we make sense of the immense number of plants and pollinators out there, and how do you systematically go about studying and the interactions between them?
Yeah, so it is painstaking, because if you look at plant-pollinator interactions in the field or in forests and in natural settings, so there is no better way than actually being in the field to actually observe these interactions. And these are based on data that are collected in the field painstakingly over several flowering seasons, over several years, very often, in order to capture the entirety of these interactions. And when I say that, what I mean is that we know that these interactions are not something that are inflexible or fixed. They can change. And when do they change? They can change, for example, across years. The wiring of these interactions can change. They can change if there is some event, like if there is some, for example, let us say that there is a year where the drought is intense or when the rainfall is very heavy. So these interactions are all the time, they're not fixed, and they're dynamic and they can keep changing. So therefore, in order to try and understand these things entirely, it's not sufficient to just have data from one season where you observed, which plants are interacting with which pollinators and so on. You need to follow this across multiple seasons in order to try and see how variable they are.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, pick one location and follow the plants and pollinator of that location across few years. So
so it's an investment in a site, right? So the longer you work in a particular study site, the more data you accumulate, and that forms the backdrop for further studies. So that is the benefit of, sort of why we tend to have a few sites and work intensely over the years from those sites. Yeah. So the larger peer builds up in that way. So that you can't achieve by moving between sites. So so we do try to pick sites which are representative of a particular habitat type they're interested in. So it could be maybe the wet evergreen tropics, which then in our country, if you look at it, it's either Northeast India or it's the southern part of the Western Ghats. Or if you're looking at other kinds of vegetation, like for example, if you're looking at tropical dry deciduous forests, then maybe other areas, you want to look at the Eastern Ghats, perhaps the more arid areas. If you want a desert vegetation, then you have to go elsewhere and so on. So we pick these sites. I mean, some of it is also based on convenience. And then we try to, sort of work out of those sites for years so that understanding builds over time. And then we, are able to make more sense of these interactions. Or any other ecological study for that matter.
Right. Would you be able to run us through some of the findings that you have found in one of these locations that you are following up?
Okay, so my experience, when I say it's my team and me. So we have experience working in the northern part of the Western Ghats, in the southern Western Ghats. We have been doing some work in the Eastern Ghats, and then more recently in in Kutch, so that's more arid and sort of desert kind of habitats. So in terms of interesting findings, like I mentioned today, that one thing that we have found across these communities that are very different in terms of the vegetation is that there appears to be a lot of generalization. What I mean by that is that a particular flower species is serviced by many pollinators, and the other way around also. A pollinator is not just dependent on one or two plant species or flower species. They are visiting a range of species. So this is something which is quite, it seems that generalization is quite prevalent. The other thing, if I can think of off the cuff, is that we do find that, for example, if you look at, data that we accumulated over time, we find that nocturnal plants are important, form a significant part of communities. And by this, what I mean
nocturnal plants?
Nocturnal, flowers that open at night and are pollinated at night by moths or bats or nocturnal bees and so on. So this is an important part, which is often neglected part, because we as humans, and we are very visual creatures, and we also restrict our fieldwork times because of logistics and other reasons to the day. Okay, we start at maybe early, then end by sunset and so on. But there's a lot happening at night, and that's it's a very interesting interaction, which is quite hidden from plain view, in plain sight. And so therefore, those interactions, in my opinion, tend to be more specialized, whereas the diurnal interactions tend to be more generalized. It could be an artifact of the fact that there are many more diurnal pollinators as compared to nocturnal pollinators at night. So there are these basic differences that we really haven't, sort of elucidated so far in great detail.
Got it. So, in the current circumstances, what do you think all of us can learn from the kinds of studies you are undertaking?
I think the most important, if you talk about what affects us or the average human being on the planet or the Indian citizen in this country, is that one is the importance of understanding, other than the fundamental science, there is also a direct, when you talk about pollinators, we are in effect talking about biodiversity, the persistence of biodiversity, because wild plants depend on pollinators, especially in the tropics, where they're very dependent on animals for pollination, insects, birds, bats, so on. The other is from the food security perspective, okay, because lots of our food crops are pollinated by animals, right?
And are these diurnal plants generally or nocturnal?
It could be both. It could be both. Yeah. So there are many diurnal, vegetables and foods that are pollinated by diurnal pollinators. There are a few that are pollinated at night also. Or
the reason I asked that is because you said that the diurnal plants follow a more generalized pattern.
Yeah.
Which then tells me that they are probably not at as much risk as the nocturnal plants, which have a more specific pollinator?
It's a bit hard to say that, because the question you're asking me, I think, is that is it that there is some sort of robustness or there is some sort of redundancy in the diurnal flowers, which is not there with the nocturnal flowers. So I don't know if there is a simple, straightforward answer to that. At least I'm not familiar with that. But one would guess that perhaps you're dependent on fewer pollinators. If something were to happen to those pollinators, which prevents them pollinating the flowers, so then you would expect that, they are more vulnerable, right? So, but I don't think we have hard data to say anything conclusively, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is,
But we hope to that kind of data.
We hope so, but again, it's not the work of one lab or one group or one PI and a bunch of students. So very often these things scale up when you have, a critical mass of people working it, which is a huge, sort of drawback in our country, or a limitation, I would say, in our country, where efforts are isolated, and in order for a big picture to emerge, it's not the work of one team or a small team of people. And there also has to be continuity, and there has to be interest in going back to the same sites and repeatedly sampling from the same sites, which is the big advantage that researchers in America or Europe have. Their sites are very well studied, and there are generations of researchers which continue the work. So over time it builds knowledge, which is missing in our scenario.
So that also brings me to the final question on trying to understand the Indian community of researchers who are studying similar questions. Are there other researchers who are looking at plant pollinator interactions who might be following up other areas?
Yes. There are research groups, of course, working in various institutions and in various sites in India. It's better than what it was, but even this, in my opinion, is not enough. If you have to scale up, then the thing that you need is there should be a common set of questions that are identified, and these questions are addressed in multiple sites using common methodology, which then makes these methods and results comparable, which is something that is largely missing. There are efforts in that direction, but it hasn't quite taken off.
Thank you so much, Hema, for running us through the world of
it was nice talking
plants
to you.
and pollinators.